Ok.
Ok, il convegno è ufficialmente aperto.
Dunque, buonasera a tutti quanti. Io sono molto lieto che abbia inizio questo ciclo di 3 incontri sulla Mitteleuropa ebraica, che è un ciclo che l'Associazione di Studi Ebraico-Tedeschi ha organizzato insieme all'Università di Trento e più nello specifico insieme al Laboratorio di Studi Umanistici sugli scambi culturali e con la Mitteleuropa, che è un laboratorio che afferisce poi al centro di alti studi umanistici. Dicevo, io sono davvero molto contento di questa collaborazione che è stata finora proficua nell'organizzazione, sicuramente sarà proficua nei contenuti, e sono anche contento che permetta questa collaborazione di estendere la partecipazione anche agli studenti e anche ai dottorandi, di cui vedo una rappresentanza. Saluto molto cordialmente e ringrazio il primo relatore di oggi, che poi Roberta ci presenterà, che è il professor Luis Krausz. Ecco, quindi oggi partiamo e sono sicuro che sarà un bel viaggio. E direi che è tutto. Ringrazio di nuovo, torno a ringraziare il professor Krausz, ringrazio tutti i partecipanti e ringrazio davvero di cuore Roberta, che ha fatto gran parte del lavoro di organizzazione. Grazie, ti cedo la parola, Roberta.
Grazie Massimiliano. Siamo molto contenti, questa è la prova del fuoco per l'associazione che abbiamo fondato, un'associazione di studi ebraico-tedeschi che per ora raccoglie soltanto rigidamente gli amici e che forse un domani diventerà anche più accademica, ma in questo momento è, come dire, un gruppo di lavoro che secondo me in cui l'aspetto del confronto su vecchi e nuovi temi che ci stanno molto a cuore è particolarmente importante. Abbiamo deciso di occuparci di Mitteleuropa perché secondo noi è un punto su cui vale la pena riflettere e lo facciamo in questi primi 3 incontri di giugno, poi intendiamo riprendere perché la Mitteleuropa è un tema che ci sta molto a cuore. Cercando anche di scardinare alcuni punti di vista sulla Mitteleuropa piuttosto rassicuranti, piacevoli, in qualche modo, come dire, da placebo rispetto ai dolori della modernità, e invece ritrovare tutte le contraddizioni che ci possono essere all'interno della Mitteleuropa, nella creazione dell'idea di Mitteleuropa e nella sua propagazione. C'era Ugo von Hofmannsthal che diceva che cambiando i contorni delle cose, le cose cambiano radicalmente aspetto. La nostra scommessa è, seguendo questa proposta, questa provocazione anche di Hofmannsthal, di cercare confini diversi, contorni diversi, prospettive diverse per affrontare il tema della Mitteleuropa. Hofmannsthal mette in questa sua idea di un passato europeo sicuramente, tutti i suoi miti dell'aristocrazia, tutti i suoi miti della rivoluzione conservatrice, tutti i suoi miti di un mondo che guarda al futuro radicalmente ancorato nel presente. E molti altri autori hanno cercato di fare della Mitteleuropa un vestito, come dire, tradizionale in cui inserire una volontà incerta, corrusca, complicata di futuro. In realtà se noi guardiamo i libri di storia, ed è da questo che poi siamo partiti, vediamo che il concetto di Mitteleuropa è un concetto che ha inventato Bismarck. E ha inventato Bismarck in una prospettiva ovviamente coloniale, impossessarsi dei paesi a est della Germania, della nuova grande Germania, e quindi in qualche modo imporre un modello tedesco sul mondo che questo modello non lo aveva, non lo voleva o con cui aveva un rapporto contraddittorio. Il mondo asburgico, con le sue forme, in qualche modo riprende questa idea tradizionale, cioè tradizionalmente politica di Mitteleuropa, e quindi secondo me questa connotazione così coloniale di Mitteleuropa rimane poi anche dopo, ed è su questo che vorrei in qualche modo provare a lavorare. Credo che nessuno più dell'amico Louis Krausz possa avere, come dire, una prospettiva che cambia i nostri contorni, non solo perché lavorando sulla Mitteleuropa lui ha messo spesso in evidenza, insieme a Yolande Perez, che sono molto contenta di avere qui, ha messo molto in evidenza questo aspetto di una nuova prospettiva, un nuovo modo, un nuovo passaggio tra i molti passaggi che ha la Mitteleuropa, ma anche perché vivendo in Brasile e guardando più emigrazioni di quelle che guardiamo noi, più transiti di quelli che guardiamo noi, può trovare quei nuovi contorni che Hofmannsthal aveva in qualche modo indicato. La biografia ho chiesto a Louis Krausz una biografia completa, un curriculum completo. Siccome abbiamo solo un'ora e non 14 ore, sarò molto, come dire, veloce e casomai lo mettiamo poi agli atti di questa giornata di incontro. È professore di ebraico e di letteratura ebraica e di letteratura tedesca, quindi per noi della nostra associazione, e direi anche per Massimiliano, oltre che forse anche per Stefano che ci sta seguendo, è il meglio. Letteratura tedesca e letteratura ebraica contemporaneamente, è la persona che sicuramente ha più sensibilità per questo mondo. In questo momento è fellow dell'Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung alla Freie Universität di Berlino. Ha studiato in America, a Zurigo e a San Paolo, quindi come dire ha potuto anche spaziare metodi di ricerca sul mondo ebraico e sul mondo tedesco in molti luoghi. Ha pubblicato numerosi libri scientifici, curato Übergänge, abbiamo detto, tra Esilio e Redenzione del 2019, Santuari eterodossi, ed è un libro che mi sta particolarmente a cuore perché parla di eresie, che è uno dei pallini della mia vita. Dopodiché sull'ebraismo centroeuropeo, e in particolare Aaron Appelfeld, Roth e Hermann. Poi passaggi, letteratura giudaica tedesca, e poi Joseph Roth e la nostalgia giudaica. Tutti questi libri dal 2008 a oggi. Ma la cosa che non conoscevo e che mi ha molto sorpreso, e devo dire anche mi rende molto ammirata, è la incredibile attività letteraria e i numerosi premi che ha ricevuto come scrittore, cosa che nel nostro mondo accademico è purtroppo troppo rara. Ha poi pubblicato moltissime traduzioni dal tedesco di autori di origine ebraica, ma non solo, ci sono anche autori della letteratura tedesca e della letteratura austriaca, come per esempio la Jelinek e poi Delius, Schwab. Quindi un'attività tutto tondo. So, I think we can switch to English, or at least try to do it. And I would like to introduce your conference, quoting a suggestive reflection you did in your book, Übergänge, with Julian as well. And I quote it, and I think can be a very interesting beginning for us. The Hebrew word for Hebrew is ivri. Ivri comes from the verb la abor, to go through. To go through, and ivri is someone who goes through something. In this sense, the essays in this volume deal with Jewish writer in Central Europe, and in each case also with passage, and do so in many different ways. Central Europe can be understood as a transit point in several respects. between the culture and religions of the East and the West, between the Slavic and the German-speaking world, between the Occident and the Muslim, Balkan world, but also between the North and the South of Europe. It is a region of peaceful, but also less peaceful relationship and encounters. From this perspective of countless and often very differentiated passages, I would like to ask you something about your project, dear Louis. And in particular, I would like to know something about the theoretical question, the problems that you and Juliane have faced, the achievement, and also the questions that are still open. Please.
Dear Roberta, first of all, I want to thank you very much for inviting me for this conference. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you, to be with Juliana, to be with Andrea Lombardi, who is also with us, and to talk a little bit about our research endeavors and in particular about this book. The question of a Jewish Central Europe or a Jewish Mitteleuropa is a question that, as I understand it, appears only after the beginning of Jewish emancipation in Europe. That is, after the beginning of the 19th century. Before that, of course, there were Jews living in a territory that could be described as Central European, but their way of life, their outlook on life, their perspectives were in no way different from those of Jews living in other European ghettos, either in the West or in the East, either in the Ukraine or in Poland or in northern Germany, for instance. There was a very long history of a Jewish presence in Europe, in the so-called Yiddish land. And this Yiddish land was a territory that went from Hamburg to Trieste and from Vilna to Metz in the Alsace, for instance. So it was a huge territory where Jews used to live in a state of relative isolation in relation to their environment. It was a world closed in itself. It was a world that had a very strong cohesion determined by religious belief and determined especially by the belief that Jews were exiles in Europe, that their place was not in Europe, and that they were in Europe basically expecting the arrival of the Messiah, which would lead them back eventually to the promised land, to the land of their origin. So there was no question of Central Europe in the Jewish world at this point. I mean, until the beginning of the 19th century, even though there was a large Jewish population in this geographical region. Therefore, our perspective in our project as a whole, and in this book in particular, is connected less to a geographical space than to a philosophical, existential, or even national space. So the idea of Jewish Mitteleuropa only begins to make sense when the doors of the ghettos are opened and when the Jews begin to leave their ghettos behind and to try to integrate, to assimilate into the wider Central European culture, which was, of course, in the 19th century determined up to a certain point by Austro-German culture, Habsburg culture in this territory. So that's why our outlook on this phenomenon of Mitteleuropa is the outlook of a psychological space, a space of transition, a space of discussion between worldviews that are often conflicting with each other, between the Jewish tradition that was slowly being left behind and, of course, the challenge of 19th century Austrian civilization. Besides that, I think there is another important point, the contrasts that existed within the Middle European territory, the contrasts that existed within the Habsburg monarchy, which was very heterogeneous. On the one hand, there was the world of Vienna and the western parts of the empire, which were very attuned to Western European standards and models of thought and social structures and so on. On the other hand, there were the lands in the east, close to the Russian border, and I am referring, of course, to Galicia and Bukovina, which were very, very primitive in their structure, and where the whole social life was completely different from what happened in the big cities. And of course, this also has to do with transition. This also has to do with passages, as we see that gradually Jews from this vast territory begin to migrate toward the western parts of the empire, towards Vienna, of course, and other big cities. But also, even during the 19th century, within the Habsburg Empire, we see a strong resistance to these new ideas and to these new outlooks on life and to these new lifestyles, and a strong attachment to Jewish tradition, which was especially strong, of course, in the religious movement of Hasidism, which flourished basically within the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 19th century. So this is how basically we try to understand this phenomenon of Jewish Central Europe as a psychological territory, as an intellectual territory, and as a space of transition, and as a space of passages. And we see that these passages also can happen in the opposite direction. These passages are not only passages from the ghetto and from the traditional way of Jewish life into 19th century modernity, into bourgeois life, into urban environments and industrial economies. But, and this is especially true after World War I, there is also an opposite movement, a movement leading Jews who grew up with a very German education, with a very westernized education, with a very lay and scientific outlook on life, making huge efforts to reconnect with these lost roots of traditional Judaism. I think maybe the best known example of that is the German Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, who grew up in a bourgeois home and whose philosophical researches have led him back to that by then almost abandoned world of Eastern European Hasidism and of Eastern European folklore and even religious traditions. Another very well-known example is that of Gershom Scholem, of course, who was also born in Berlin into a very assimilated, Germanized family, and who spent his whole life researching the Jewish mysticism from the Middle Ages, from the 18th century, from the 19th century, and of course, we cannot forget Kafka and Kafka's interest in the Yiddish theater, which he saw in Prague, and which was for him like a sort of epiphany. These people coming from another age, from another world, and speaking a language that was abhorred by Germanized Jews, by assimilated Jews, Yiddish, and the fascination that this causes on Kafka is also another aspect of this movement in the opposite direction. So that's how Juliana and I tried to understand Mitteleuropa as a territory of transit, as a territory of passage, and of course also as a territory of dialogue and of conflict. Well, I hope I have answered your question, dear Roberta.
Okay, now I'm here. So thank you very, very much. I would like to know something more about the question you didn't resolve and the new question you had to face and now you are trying to solve. So your new research, your new projects, what are you studying on? What are you searching on?
I have, I mean, of course, this whole discussion of Mitteleuropa is in a way comes to an end with World War II and with the destruction of Central European Judaism in all its different phases, in all of its different aspects. Everything was liquidated, basically. And there are hardly any leftovers of this complex, fascinating, enormously rich a Jewish world, or Jewish worlds, because there were actually several Jewish worlds coexisting in this Middle European space in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. But the one thing all of them have in common, all of these Jewish worlds that existed in Central Europe, the one thing they had in common is the fact that they were destroyed without exception and without any distinction about how Germanized or not Germanized these Jews were. From the point of view of Nazism, there was no difference between assimilated, acculturated, Germanized Jews or provincial, religious, Hasidic Jews living in the Russian border. This has all disappeared, and this has all been put in a common grave, basically. So for a while, and this is a project that I have also had the participation of Liliana Feierstein from Humboldt University, who could not be here today, unfortunately. We have tried to trace the fragments of these Jewish Central European cultures in the places where these Jews have escaped to. Israel, on the one hand, South America, on the other hand, Western Europe, England, the United States, of course, and other places in the world. All of these different Central European Jewish cultures have become cultures in exile. In the eve of World War II and after World War II, and have gradually disappeared in these places of exile, have become less and less consistent, have become less and less particular and characteristic, and have either melted into the mainstream in these lands of exile, or have melted into the Jewish mainstreams in these places of exile. So on the one hand, I have tried to search a little bit about these fragments, about these leftovers of a Jewish European culture, about these Jewish Central European memories in the works of basically novelists who have written about this theme. And in that sense, I think one of the biggest and most important names we should remember is that of Aharon Appelfeld. I don't know whether all of you are familiar with Aharon Appelfeld. Aharon Appelfeld is not a novelist who has written in German, even though his native language was German. He was a Jew from Czernowitz, who grew up in an assimilated German-speaking Jewish family in Czernowitz, and who survived World War II as a child. He was deported from his home as an 8-year-old boy, and he has miraculously survived the war in Europe and has been taken to Israel, or to what was then a British Palestine in 1946, has then undergone an education in Hebrew, has become a writer in Hebrew, but all of his novels deal with the lost world of his childhood and with the lost world of his childhood memories in Czernowitz, in the home of an assimilated German-speaking Jewish family from the Bukovina. All of you know how important Czernowitz was as a center of German language literature in the 20th century. And Juliana is here as our greatest Paul Celan specialist in Brazil, but not only in Brazil. And Paul Celan is maybe the best proof of what I am saying. Paul Celan was also a Czernowitzer, who knew his German much better than many German novelists, than many novelists who were born in Germany or in post-World War I Austria. So Appelfeld is one big name in this culture, in this literary culture of the fragment, of the leftovers, of the shades of Jewish Mitteleuropa. But beyond that, and more recently in my research, I have been trying to investigate to what extent this world of German Jewish dialogue and of German Jewish encounter has begun to flourish after Nazism, after World War II. And maybe one of the earliest examples of that is the Austrian Jewish novelist, Hilde Spiel. I don't know whether all of you are familiar with Hilde Spiel. Just one second. But I think Hilde Spiel deserves the title of being the first German Jewish writer who tried to somehow repair this destroyed connection between Jews and Vienna, between Jews and Central Europe. During World War II, Hilde Spiel, who was a Viennese, of course, was exiled in London, and she worked for the BBC as a war front reporter, a very courageous woman. And in the beginning of 1946, she writes this book, Rückkehr nach Wien, ein Tagebuch, in which she describes the trip she makes to Vienna, to her Heimat, in January 1946 or February 1946, and how she tries to reconnect to this place. And actually, a few years later, only in 1963, Hilde Spiel settles in Vienna and spends the rest of her life in Vienna as a novelist and as a journalist, as a writer of short stories. So she's one of these names that have somehow tried to do the impossible, tried to reconstruct in a way what has been lost forever after Nazism. And with that, also more recently, I am trying to look at other authors, in particularly Robert Menasse. I mean, Robert Menasse's belonging to Judaism is a very controversial question. I know about that. But still, he has a Jewish name. And at least by anti-Semites, he is seen as a Jew. So he has a connection to Judaism. And beyond that, he has a connection to Brazil, and he has a connection to San Paolo, because he was for a while a lector at the university where my colleague Juliana and I teach. And he has lived in San Paolo for half a year or for 1 year or even longer, I'm not sure. And he has established a relationship with the community of exiled Austrian Jewish intellectuals in San Paolo, which was a very, and in a way still is, a very interesting community with names that have become quite important in Brazilian intellectual life, like Otto Maria Carpo, like Robert Schwartz, like Paul Singer. And he has established a relationship with these people. And he has written two Brazilian novels which play partly in Vienna and partly in São Paulo, and which of course are full of Jewish themes and of Jewish questions. And I don't have to explain to you why these novels are so especially appealing for me, since I myself come from a Viennese family that has been exiled in São Paulo. So that's what I am working on now, and all the time, of course, I try to establish connections between what he says and how he sees São Paulo, how he sees Austrian Jews in São Paulo, how he sees Austrian Jews who grew up in São Paulo and then go back to Vienna, and of course, this brings up a lot of historical associations. Dealing with this 19th century Middle European space, this Middle European psychological space that is, as I have said before, a space of passage, a space of transition, a space of encounter, conflict, dialogue. So with that, I have come to the impression that as opposed to what I used to believe so far, this world has not come to a complete end yet. This world somehow exists. And of course, in addition to that, we should not forget that in the meantime, Vienna, but more than Vienna, Germany, have become places with quite important Jewish communities again. And again, with Jewish communities that have come from the East, that have come from Russia. Of course, it's a completely different history. We are no longer talking about Hasidic Jews with their beards going to Vienna and then trying to become assimilated and trying to Germanize and shaving and learning German and so on and so forth. We are talking about Jews who grew up under the communist regime of the Soviet Union. We are talking about Jews who were seen as Jews by the Soviet state, but who had actually never had the opportunity to learn anything about Jewish traditions and so forth. We are talking about a completely different reality. And of course, the world they have found in the West no longer has anything to do with this promised land of Berlin and Vienna in the 19th century. It's a completely different reality. But somehow the theme of the encounter between Jews and German in the Middle European space has become contemporary again. So this is what I am trying to investigate now.
Thank you so much, Luis. I would like to ask Juliane if she can add something. I think you can speak Portuguese, and Susanna, if it's possible, could translate, or if you don't want to speak English, as you prefer. Dottor Valenzin, potrei chiederle di aprire il microfono a Juliane Perez e a Susanna Camplages?
Adesso sì. Io posso cercare di parlare in italiano, se
Oh, che meraviglia, grazie!
Allora, se diventa troppo confuso, non so, qualcuno mi aiuta.
Va bene.
Oppure in tedesco, Giuliana.
Ma qui c'è qualcuno che non lo conosce.
Ah, ok, forse... ok, meglio italiano. Meglio.
Sì.
Ok, facciamolo in italiano. Bene. No, bene, cioè, penso che la cosa interessante di questo libro che è stato sotto nostra cura è questa idea di un paesaggio immaginario, no? Di una geografia immaginaria che è un poco l'idea di Liliana Feierstein e che è molto bella, mi sembra, no? Ed è anche interessante vedere che, cioè, quando non c'è un luogo concreto, cioè quando non c'è più il luogo fisico, uno si inventa un luogo a cui si appartiene, no? E questo, e anche se è un luogo drammatico, un po' immaginario, un po' no, però abbastanza fragile, è un luogo di appartenenza, no? Bene, questo sul libro. Su quello che faccio adesso è un po' la continuazione di quello che ho fatto con Paul Celan, che c'è anche questa, anche se non è una narrativa, no? C'è anche questa, diciamo, questo dolore profondo di aver perduto tutto. Solo che forse per lui è un po' più drammatico perché lui sa che questa ricostruzione nella letteratura è anche un'utopia, no? È anche impossibile, no? Anche se lui parla del meridiano, per esempio, no? Per rimanere nel tema del luogo che esiste però non esiste, no? Lui dice, per esempio, in questo famoso testo, no? Il meridiano, che è la Büchner Preisrede, no? E qui dice: non trovo più il mio luogo nel cartello, però lo trovo come meridiano, che è una linea immaginaria tra persone, autori, dati, punti che creano un altro mondo, no? Un mondo dove lui può respirare, no? Allora un po' vado in questa direzione, quello che faccio, vado ancora in questa direzione.
Una domanda: come avete scelto gli autori del libro? Perché nel libro ci sono personaggi molto diversi tra di loro, no? Cioè avete parlato di autori che fanno parte veramente di una costellazione, spesso non immediatamente conciliabile. Come mai li avete scelti?
Luis? Bene, un po' c'era la configurazione del progetto, no? Cioè abbiamo incominciato questo progetto con Liliana Feierstein e l'idea originale era farlo un po' un paragone tra diverse discipline, no? Vedere rabbini, autori di sociologia, filosofia, letteratura, un po' così, no? Ebbene, l'idea era un po' troppo ampia, ma forse...
No. Mi chiedevo come mai avete cominciato con Bene, cioè non c'era assolutamente una cronologia, no? Cioè nel senso che c'erano, come dire, autori di prima messi e così via, quindi non era una cosa cronologica, era una cosa tematica. E questo inizio con Benjamin, che mi è sembrato molto provocatorio, molto interessante. Come mai avete cominciato con Benjamin?
Luis, möchtest du? Das war deine Idee eigentlich.
Okay.
Yeah. Also, well, I was speaking English.
English, yeah, please.
So, actually, we have invited some people to participate in this project, and we have not tried to force anything on them. On the contrary, since this world of Central European Judaism is so vast and so diverse, we have tried to leave the choice to the people we wanted to work with. So, as a matter of fact, the book has a somewhat chaotic characteristic, as you all have noted. I mean, we go from Theodor Herzl to Walter Benjamin, from Heschel to Leon Feuchtwanger. There is not immediately a visible connection between all these authors, but we have thought that this somehow would translate the complexity and the diversity and with that also the richness of this psychological intellectual space, how many different and non-communicating things fit into this concept of Central European Judaism. So the heterogeneous and somewhat chaotic character of the book was not deliberate, of course, but I believe is a result of the enormous richness of the world we are trying to somehow analyze and represent, as if each one of these authors that we have discussed in the book was in himself a fragment of this enormously complex, enormously long-lasting, and enormously interesting world of Central European Judaism, a world that begins to exist with the beginning of the 19th century, with the beginning of Jewish emancipation in the Habsburg Empire, and which along 150 years until the beginning of World War II has been so enormously fruitful and so enormously important, not only in the Jewish world, but in Western culture itself. I mean, we're talking about authors like Walter Benjamin, we are talking about Sigmund Freud, we are talking about people who have actually made a difference in the world and who belonged to this world, who had their roots in this world.
Bene, grazie infinite Luis, grazie molte anche a Giuliana e complimenti per il meraviglioso italiano che ci ha fatto particolarmente piacere, grazie. A questo punto io chiederei se ci sono domande e in particolare, se è possibile, ho visto, non c'è più, c'era Ann Betten, volevo chiederle se poteva intervenire ma non la vedo, perché su alcuni dei temi di cui ha parlato Krausz, Ann Betten ha molto lavorato, avrebbe secondo me potuto dire delle cose molto interessanti su questo mondo che si ricostruisce e si perde. Quindi invece allora a questo punto chiederei a voi di fare delle domande, le scriverei, se qualcuno ha da fare domande più complicate chiediamo di accendervi il microfono. Come al solito è difficilissimo incominciare una discussione. Massimiliano, come padrone di casa, incomincio a te, poi vediamo se ci sono altre questioni aperte, volentieri.
So I'll try to, can you hear me? Okay, I'll try to ask a question. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Krausz for his very interesting speech, and Juliana Perez too. And so apart from the romantic and late romantic aspect of the concept of Middle Europe about which Roberta spoke before, what continues to function, in my opinion, even nowadays, in an era of newly uprising nationalisms and sovranismi, is the idea, as Juliana said before, of an alternative geography, of Middle Europe as an alternative geography, which is not based on the concept of national state and of territory. And this gives rise to an identity based on language, or on languages, on culture, or on cultures. So rather than on territory. And my question is, what is left? What remains of this idea, of this dimension after the loss, after the exile, after the flight, after the loss of the homeland? Is it only a matter of recollection, of memory, or does it partake in founding a new identity. Thank you.
Juliana, I think you should answer this question.
Lo rispondo in italiano?
Sì.
Sì, bene. Io penso che cioè quello che resta è un po' la letteratura stessa, no? Cioè diciamo che c'è un'esistenza nei libri, no? E questo è particolarmente interessante quando si pensa anche alla cultura ebrea, no? Cioè quel valore supremo del libro, no? Allora questo è un aspetto, no? E l'altra cosa che direi così in modo generale è che, beh, non sarei dire se c'è una nuova identità, ma siccome c'è un'identità che diciamo che si mescola con altre cose, perché una volta che è fatta sui libri e sull'immaginario, si mescola molto di più con altre cose che sono anche quelle che, per esempio, un autore in esilio riceve di quel posto dove adesso è, no? Allora si forma una cosa nuova. In questo senso sì, direi di sì, sarebbe una nuova identità, però senza che quella antica si perda, no? Si sparisca, diciamo. Questo come tentativo di risposta.
Grazie molto, grazie.
Proporrei però anche un'altra, forse, non lo butto lì così, e cioè che la Mitteleuropa è un'idea conservatrice, i conservatori. L'idea fondamentale di Massimiliano è che invece è un'idea che può diventare progressista. Quindi l'antimodernità come dire, il ripescaggio dell'antimodernità come progetto, come progetto progressivo, molto interessante. Temo però che sia un altro discorso, cioè un altro mondo, cioè come dire, è una nuova geografia del bene contro modernità, con tutti i suoi limiti. Esattamente però come era prima, cambiano le parole, cambiano i significati delle parole, le speranze, però come dire, bisogna fare i conti con una tradizione profondamente conservatrice dell'idea di Mitteleuropa. E se tu ora la ripresenti in questo modo, la trasformi in un'ipotesi progressiva. E su questo bisogna che ci pensiamo un po' tutti. Dunque, io penso che Massimiliano abbia rotto il ghiaccio. Se ci sono altre domande sono... Ah, ecco, Laura, un'idea conservatrice che esiste solamente in tedesco? Laura, non fare domande così difficili. C'è anche Esther, perfetto, c'è Camilla Calvi. You have a lot of questions to answer, so please, can you read the chat? Yes,
Can I read?
Esther Saletta has a question, die Mehrsprachigkeit.
Just a second, I think I can read the chat, yes. Yes, yeah. So my question deals with the problem of Mehrsprachigkeit. In which sense would you focus this aspect in the whole panorama of authors you have taken into consideration in your book? Yes, I think this is a very interesting question because especially when you're talking about Jewish Central Europe, of course, there is always this underlying dialogue between German and Yiddish, and between Yiddish words, Yiddish expressions, which of course add a whole new dimension to the language of these authors, and bring a lot of contents that could actually not be expressed in a language other than Yiddish. So this, for one thing, I think is a very, very important aspect that should be taken into consideration. Of course, not in all of the German speaking and German writing authors and poets of Central Europe, but in many of them, Yiddish is somehow a presence, even though there might be no actual Yiddish words. Let's take as an example Arthur Schnitzler. Arthur Schnitzler is this enormously elegant stylist of German literature at the turn of the century, and he writes a German that is extremely musical to the ears. In a way, I think it's the essence of Viennese German that you can find in Schnitzler's book, in Schnitzler's books. At the same time, he often has characters who speak Yiddish, even though he doesn't reproduce their words, but he mentions them, and he says, so-and-so spoke so-and-so in Yiddish. And this brings a completely dissonant note to the text. At the same time as it makes a big irony in relation to all this aristocratic pretensions of assimilated Viennese Jews. What I have in mind now is a character from what I consider his masterpiece, Der Weg ins Freie. I'm not sure whether all of you are familiar with this novel, but one of the characters in Der Weg ins Freie is Herr Ehrenberg, S. Ehrenberg, because actually his name is Salomon Ehrenberg. But Salomon sounds very bad since he is a wealthy Jewish businessman who has this huge apartment on the Ringstraße, and his wife makes a point of inviting members of the Viennese aristocracy to her salon, and she emulates very successfully the manners of the Viennese aristocracy and so on and so forth. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of one of these receptions, these elegant receptions in this gorgeous Ringstraße Wohnung, in this gorgeous Ringstraße apartment, Herr Ehrenberg suddenly begins to speak Yiddish very loudly. And his wife and his son, they want to melt, they want to die, they want to disappear. They are so embarrassed by this appearance of the old Jewish world, which is emblematized by Yiddish and which is absolutely unheimlich. It's really, I think, the example of the unheimlich. So this is a way in which this question of Mehrsprachigkeit can be used ironically, in a very, very interesting manner, because irony always opens up a new perspective on a specific reality. On the other hand, speaking of Mehrsprachigkeit, I think again of Aharon Appelfeld. Aharon Appelfeld, this boy, this Czernowitzer German-speaking boy, who was deported from his home as an 8-year-old boy, and who ends up in Israel, who ends up writing his novels in Israel, but I mean, he ends up writing his novels in Hebrew, but all of his characters are not speakers of Hebrew. No one of his characters is a speaker of Hebrew. The plots of his novel are in Austria, are in Czernowitz, are in the Carpathians, are in pre-war Central Europe. So all these characters speak or used to speak in their real lives either German or Yiddish, but Appelfeld represents them without exception only in Hebrew. Their dialogues are presented to the reader in Hebrew, but they are supposed to be dialogues in German or in Yiddish, because this is the language these characters actually spoke in the 1930s. So this is another very puzzling aspect of multilingualism in Central European Jewish literature.
So thank you very much. We have two more questions, and I think we can answer the question, and then I think we have to close our meeting. Laura, could you translate your question? Okay, the question is of the idea is only in German-speaking authors. What do you think about?
I'm sorry, Roberta, I couldn't hear you.
Okay, here is written, the question is written in English, so I think you or Juliana, you could answer.
Mitteleuropa as a conservative are you referring to Laura's questions? Question?
Yeah, Laura's question.
Okay, as a conservative Europe, as a conservative idea that can only exist in German. No, I absolutely disagree with that. I think one of the most important aspects of Mitteleuropa is the fact that it's a space where many languages meet and where many languages interact with each other. And I mean, again, I come back to Czernowitz. There is no better example, I think. Czernowitz is a city where people spoke. There is this beautiful poem by Rose Ausländer about über die Karpfen, die in ihre Gelee auf 5 Sprachen schwiegen in Czernowitz. I don't remember the poem by heart now, but it's a beautiful poem where she describes these carps in gelatin and how they were silent at her Czernowitz home in 5 different languages. So they were silent in Romanian, they were silent in Yiddish, they were silent in German, they were silent in Ukrainian, and they were silent, I don't know, either in Russian or in French, because cultivated Chernovitzers also loved to speak French, especially after Czernowitz had become part of Romania. So, so I think the coexistence between languages and the dialogues between languages, the passages from one language to the other, are one of the fundamental aspects, not of Bismarckian Mitteleuropa, but of Jewish Mitteleuropa, of course. And not only of Jewish Europa, Mitteleuropa. I think, for example, of a novel which probably many of you know, by Ivo Andrić, The Bridge over the Drina. Ivo Andrić was this wonderful Bosnian author who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and the description he makes of this town, of this bridge over the Drina, especially in the final chapters of the book, and how the German-speaking Austrians relate to the local Bosnian population, how Galician Jews come to this town and settle there, and how they all speak different languages, is one of the central aspects of the book. And I think the idea of bridge, which is so present in this novel by Ivo Andrić, is also emblematic of what Mitteleuropa, at least as I try to see it, represents. It's more than anything a bridge. It's neither one border nor the other border, but what is in between and what can take from one side to the other. And therefore, multilingualism, as I see it, is a central, radically central concept in this conception of Mitteleuropa as an imaginary territory, as an intellectual territory.
Posso aggiungere una cosa? Laura, se tu calcoli l'importanza, Fovea sono gli scrittori della Jungvilne, della traduzione chiaramente dal tedesco. Thomas Mann, per esempio, era uno dei più amati, ma tutta la decadenza europea. Cioè il problema, anche se continuavano a parlare in Yiddish, c'era l'esigenza di trasferire le altre lingue, no? Cioè la sfida è anche l'esigenza. Quindi si crea poi una coenè, anche, come sai benissimo, anche in Yiddish, che è una mediazione tra lo Yiddish e le lingue della cultura, soprattutto tedesca. C'è qualche francese, traducono, sai bene, qualche francese traducono addirittura D'Annunzio, ma penso che il grande è proprio la traduzione dal tedesco come incontro appunto tra queste due lingue simili ma non troppo, e credo che questo è importante, almeno come prospettiva, insomma. C'è la domanda, scusatemi, abbiamo poco tempo, quindi io... ok. Giovanni San Paolo ha domandato, kann man Stefan Zweigs Brasil als ein gelobtes Land lesen?
Juliana, I think you should answer that one.
Ok, grazie. Io direi di no. Cioè, io direi che questo sarebbe forse il suo desiderio, no? La sua utopia, però quando uno guarda i suoi testi, soprattutto questi che lui ha scritto alla fine della vita, tutti i luoghi sono luoghi di isolamento, diciamo. no? In Montaigne è così, c'è il Montaigne proprio la piccola torre e lui è lì nella sua torre, e dopo in questo Schachnovelle, no? che ho cercato di analizzare, no? C'è solo questo Schiff, adesso mi sfugge in italiano. La nave, sì, grazie. C'è questa nave, in questa nave questi posti che sono un po' strani, sempre chiusi, sempre così, cioè sono sempre luoghi che possiamo dire o descrivere come negativi, no? Allora, io penso che questo crea una tensione e contraddice un po' questa idea che lui ha difenduto, ha difesa nel Brasile, paese del futuro, non so se si dice così in italiano. Sì, no? Che sarebbe un'immagine positiva, no? Di un'utopia, molto più, si deve capire molto più come un'utopia e non tanto come una possibilità di fatto.
Giovanni, volevi aggiungere qualcosa? Oppure va bene? Va bene? Allora a questo punto c'è la domanda di Matteo di Taranto. Riuscite a leggerla?
Non riesco.
Bisogna tornare indietro.
Perché non riesco a salire proprio.
Sì, allora aspettate che la rifaccio. Aspettate un momento. No, come si fa? La ridigito. I think now you can read it at the end of the chat. I think you can see it.
At the end of the chat, I see Susanna's question.
Oh, and then, oh, okay. Oh. Mattia, potresti rifare la domanda? Ti dispiace, non riesco a mandarla.
Te l'ho mandata, Roberta. Prova a vedere se la vedi. Prova a vedere, Roberta, te l'ho mandata.
Grazie, Esther. È scritto è di Esther Saletta, ma in realtà è di Matteo di Taranto. Sì. Riuscite a vederla adesso? Grazie.
I can see it now.
Anche lo staff l'aveva mandato, grazie.
I had never, Mrs. Saletta, thought about this question you bring up, and it has never occurred to me, but it might be an interesting theme to investigate. But how exactly do you see these biblical themes you mention? I mean, do you see them as let's say biblical narratives, or do you see them as biblical religious ideas? And in particular, of course, the central biblical religious idea, which is the idea of redemption, the idea of return, the idea of the end of times, and of course all these theological questions that have fed Jewish philosophical speculation for so many centuries. So this is not quite clear to me. Are you talking about the paradigms of biblical narratives, of biblical fables, or are you talking about biblical religious thought?
I think I have to ask Mr. Valencin to open for Mattia di Taranto. That's a very difficult question to raise. Dottor Valencin, le posso chiedere di dare il microfono a Mattia di Taranto? Le dispiacerebbe?
Credo che i microfoni sono sganciati, siete tutti liberi di muovervi liberamente.
Allora io forse chiederei a Mattia se può parlare brevemente, perché sono già le 7:30, però è una domanda importante, penso che se può spiegare meglio.
Ciao Roberto.
Carelli non si deve preoccupare per il tempo.
Sì, soltanto l'audio è attivato, non il video, per cui non mi vedete. Comunque ho scritto anche la risposta. Sì, mostly biblical narratives as a way to reconstruct one's own Jewish identity. I think of Joseph Roth's Job, for example, but also after World War II, Nelly Sachs, in particular in den Wohnungen des Todes und Sternverdunkelung. But there are many possible examples.
Yeah, I think in that sense, biblical ideas, and I'm thinking of Joseph Roth's Job now, they serve less to reconstruct an existing identity than to foster the creation of new identities, or at least of new forms of identity. In that sense, we should not talk about conservatism, because what we see happening in Joseph Roth's Job is not a reconstruction of life of the shtetl as it was in the shtetl, but a new invention, a new way of Jewish life in a new context, which certainly has specific aspects in common with the past, but which is by no means an attempt to reconstruct the past as it was. I'm not sure I'm being clear in what I'm trying to say.
Yes, thank you. It's just, it's ultimately, my opinion, in Joseph Roth's Job, it's ultimately ruinous. It doesn't work. The new identity, the new American identity is somehow a false identity. It doesn't work as it should, in my opinion, as the, but
I'm not sure I agree with that. I mean, it's partially true if you think about Mendel Zinger's wife, about Mendel Zinger's daughter, about Mendel Zinger's sons, who have all lost their ways, so to speak, in this vertigo of the modern world. But on the other hand, the end of the novel and this appearance of Menuchim,
yes,
precisely on Pesach, on the
yes,
eve of Pesach,
yes,
no? Where when all celebrants are singing and awaiting for the arrival of Elijah.
yes, Navi.
Eliyahu HaNavi, Eliyahu HaTishbi, Eliyahu HaGiladi, Umashiach ben David. So this is an almost messianic moment of the celebration of Pesach, when people sing and await the arrival of Elijah, and who appears? Menuchim. And Menuchim, of course, transforms the life of Mendel Singer completely and puts an end to all of his suffering and brings an enormous relief to Mendel Singer, and he somehow begins to feel at home in America. America, which up to this point is portrayed, New York is portrayed as this horribly hostile and murderous and terrible place. But then all of a sudden, Mendel Singer sees the sky, and he sees the ocean, and he sees the sun, and it's a new beginning, it's a new life, it's a very promising future that opens up at this point of the narrative.
I agree. That's exactly what I meant. It's through reappropriation of his Jewish identity that he can now live in America as a Jew.
Yes, of course, but not as a Jew from the shtetl, as a new kind of Jew.
Yes.
That's the point. So that goes back to what I was saying, that the Jewish, I mean, the biblical stories, the biblical paradigms, they may serve as a structure that can take many different shapes and that can have many, many different faces. This is what I think is true about the phenomenon of Jewish diasporas as well. I mean, what does a Jew from New York have in common with a Jew from Yemen? Very little, but on the other hand, there are things in common. There are some basic structures that are shared. So there is maybe a question here of form and contents, a dynamics between what's behind and what is seen from the outside.
Yes, that's extremely interesting what you said about the fact that the question of Jewish Mitteleuropa is a question that appears after the beginning of the emancipation assimilation process. I totally agree, because my answer to that question, what do Jews from Yemen or Mitteleuropa have, or New York have in common? I would say religiously the observance of halachot. But when that fails, then you need to search for a new common ground.
Yes.
I think biblical imagery could be that common ground, apart from the observance of norms and rules.
By all means, yes. And of course, we must remember that the beginning of the emancipation is also the beginning of the end of halachot. And this is also a very Central European question. What people do with the halachot and how they reconcile the halachot with the demands of the modern world.
And Soloveitchik would answer, would have an answer for Rav Soloveitchik, the halakhic man. Probably there's a way to deal with the modern world as an halakhic.
Io penso che possiamo rimandare questa splendida discussione alla prossima volta. Sono già le 7:36, quindi vorrei concludere lasciando aperta questa bellissima riflessione che, ripeto, possiamo sicuramente approfondire la prossima volta. Vorrei ringraziare prima di tutto lo staff dell'Università di Trento che ci ha permesso di svolgere questa riunione senza nessun intoppo, mi sembra meraviglioso, grazie veramente tantissimo. A nome di Massimiliano ringrazio i relatori, che sono diventati 2 con grandissimo piacere. La presenza di Juliana è stata meravigliosa. Ringrazio molto Luis Krausz con tutte le interessantissime riflessioni col portato della sua esperienza di ricerca, e ringrazio anche Juliana con i suoi approfondimenti e la sua competenza. Vi ringrazio moltissimo. Ringrazio Susanna, che non ha dovuto tradurre, ma che era pronta a farlo, e vi ringrazio moltissimo. Ringrazio tutti i colleghi e gli amici che sono venuti questa volta, e ringrazio tutti quelli che hanno fatto delle domande così interessanti, e mi auguro che questo sia solo l'inizio di un incontro che possa continuare con Luis, con Juliana, con Massimiliano e con chi è interessato a questo tipo di questioni. Ah, Susanna, scusami! Susanna, falla, scusami. Luis, you have to answer very shortly, because okay. Susanna wanted to ask a question, but we don't have so much time, so please be short. And okay. Susanna had a very interesting question.
We can continue our discussion in Brazil.
Bitte, mach deine Frage. So, frag, was du wolltest, und dann vielleicht, wenn es zu lange geht, kann man auch so in einem italienisch, deutsch, brasilianisches Café weitergehen.
Susanna, wo ist deine Frage? Ich kann sie nicht finden.
Ah. Io te la metto.
Vielleicht kannst du
I found it. I found it. Dialogues between languages and cultures depend to a certain extent or more or less effective translations from one language to the other. In some ways, translations must always face duplicities. Do I see a connection between translation and irony? Yes, by all means. Because I think in the end, irony depends on looking at things from a different point of view, from an unexpected point of view. That's where irony comes from. You are shown something, but then instead of looking at this something's face, you look at its behind, or you look at its side, and this has a comical effect. This is precisely what translation is all about. Translation is about rendering something in a different language. And of course, each language has a specific point of view. And if you have the possibility of translating, depends on the possibility of seeing things from another point of view. Of course, as a translator, I think you have some control on that. You can either create ironic effects, or you can be a good translator and try to be faithful to the original and not betray the original. But you can definitely be very mean as a translator and twist the translation so as to construct very comical and ironical effects. And this is all there is about this mixture of Yiddish and German, I think. It gives you a lot of possibilities to be ironic. So I think it's a very, very interesting question. I think there is definitely a very close relationship between translation and irony. by all means. And I would like to say just one more word. We were talking about Soloveitchik and the halachot, but we must remember that Soloveitchik was not from Central Europe, was not a Viennese or Chernowitzer or a Middle European. He was a Litvak, and that's a completely different story.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Grazie, Luis.
Prego.
Massimiliano, concludi
Well,
te.
Roberta, thank you very much again for this stimulating invitation. It was a pleasure to be with you. It was a pleasure to be with all of you, with Juliana, with Susanna, with Andrea. It's really a consolation in these bitter times of isolation to be able to talk to so many nice and interesting people at the same time.
Grazie. Massimiliano, vuoi concludere te?
Sì,
Grazie.
sì, no, raccolgo.
Ringrazio, sono d'accordo con Luis, cioè, grazie tantissimo.
Io raccolgo tutta la soddisfazione di Roberta, che è anche la mia, e formulo tutti i ringraziamenti al professor Krausz, a Juliana per la partecipazione. E a questo punto, come dire, ci diamo l'appuntamento per la seconda puntata di questo ciclo, che è prevista per il 22 di giugno, sempre alle 18 e sempre allo stesso link Zoom. Così, chiudo
Grazie
con
infinite, grazie a tutti.
e ringrazio di
Grazie
nuovo tutti, anche allo staff tecnico informatico di Trento. Grazie, buona serata e buon pomeriggio ai brasiliani.
Grazie.